Israel Adesanya has created a strong argument for being the best crossover fighter ever in his transition from kickboxing to MMA. When assessing how successful a martial artist will be in MMA, you have to look at how their fighting style changes when they step in the cage. A commonly used example of a failed transition from kickboxing to MMA is Gokhan Saki. As a kickboxer, Saki had success with a tall stance and a high guard. However, with the introduction of takedowns and smaller gloves, this style had to be abandoned. In the cage, he came out with a loose guard and wider bladed stance that is commonly seen in MMA but isn't where Saki has been used to striking from. Adesanya, on the other hand, came with a kickboxing style that was more readily adaptable to MMA, so he didn't have to drastically change his game inside the octagon. The big question that is asked of strikers making the transition to MMA is how they will deal with the takedowns. Adesanya has done a great job at nullifying the wrestling attacks in all of his bouts at middleweight, with the only real grappling setback coming against the much larger Jan Blachowicz. The first layer of Adesanya's grappling defence, which stems from his kickboxing days, is his stance and preferred striking range. Adesanya's stance is great for adapting to takedowns, as he stands with his hands relatively low and his feet wide apart. By keeping his hands low, it's easier for Adesanya to down block on takedown attempts, preventing opponents from getting solid attachments on his legs. By standing with a wide stance, his back leg is harder to grab a hold of, effectively shutting down the double leg takedown, leaving his opponents to attack the single leg. This is easier for Adesanya to defend, as he has time to balance on his free leg before limp legging out or backing himself onto the cage to defend from there. More on his cage wrestling later. The other element of grappling defence that Adesanya brought from kickboxing is his preferred striking range. Due to often having a height and reach advantage, Adesanya usually fights at kicking/straight punching distance, especially when facing opponents that he knows are going to try and take him down. Because he doesn't spend a lot of time actively engaging in close quarters against grapplers, he is not spending a lot of time in wrestling range where his opponents can identify openings for takedowns. Adesanya's main wrestling defence is essentially making sure he is in positions where his opponents can't even start wrestling. The counter to the long distance striking strategy of Adesanya is to try and pressure him backwards towards the fence where he can't retreat any further, so is forced to engage in the wrestling. However, Adesanya has some great ways of dealing with this. In pure kickboxing, it was easier to pressure Adesanya against the ropes because of two main factors, the ring and the larger gloves. If we start with the gloves, fighters like Jason Wilness had great success pressuring Adesanya because the greater padding on the gloves meant he could rely on a high guard to block strikes. The high guard is less effective in MMA because the smaller gloves don't provide as large a shield, meaning strikes can more easily slip through gaps in the guard. The gloves are important, but I think the thing that benefited Adesanya the most was the change from the ring to the octagon. The reason for this comes down to the angle of exit that is available to Adesanya. When a fighter gets pressured backwards towards the fence or the ropes, they have three main options: move forward towards their opponent, usually with an attack, or get back into space by exiting to the left or exiting to the right. Attacking going forward doesn't change much whether you're in the ring or in the octagon, but exiting left and right definitely does. If we look at both a ring and an octagon from above, we can see why exiting to the sides is far more difficult in the ring. The 90-degree angle in the corners of the ring means the gap available to exit through is smaller than in the 135-degree angles of the octagon. Because Adesanya has spent the majority of his fighting career in the ring, he has become comfortable avoiding being pressured into corners against pure kickboxers, who tend to be far better at stopping exits than MMA fighters. This means Adesanya can take the same exit strategies he used in kickboxing and apply them to MMA, where he has more physical space to perform the exits and he's doing it against less effective cage cutters. Adesanya's main exit strategy is one that is taught in virtually all contact sports and is underutilized in MMA. This is the simple act of misdirection, making your opponent think you're going one way, then go the other. Adesanya does this by bringing his lead leg back so that his feet are level, giving himself a better ability to move laterally. He will feint side to side, confusing his opponents as to which side he will exit to. When Adesanya sees his opponent loading up on an attack, he will exit to the opposite side away from the power of the strike. Incredibly simple, but incredibly effective. Adesanya's ability to fight comfortably from both stances also massively helps his exits. He can easily switch between southpaw and orthodox depending on which direction he has to exit to. This is more difficult for single stance fighters because they tend to have poorer footwork and defensive awareness from their non-dominant stance, so can usually only exit in one direction. Occasionally, Adesanya won't be able to use the misdirection to exit and will find himself backed up to the fence where he is forced to exit in boxing range. This isn't ideal, but Adesanya showed in his title defence against Marvin Vettori that he has made big improvements in his close range boxing. Vettori would throw power combinations whenever he had Adesanya pressed against the fence. In fairness to Vettori, he did catch Adesanya a few times, but Israel also showed great head movement to slip and roll under the strikes to find his exit once again. If Adesanya finds himself unable to exit before the takedown comes, he still has his last layer of takedown defence available, the cage. Coming into MMA as a striker, it's much easier to learn how to prevent getting taken down when you have a wall to lean against than when defending attacks out in the open. Adesanya usually finds himself in two main positions when being wrestled against the fence, with his opponents attacking a double leg by trying to lock their hands around his hips, or with their hands locked around his torso in a body lock. Adesanya is comfortable here and has an almost step-by-step system to escaping from both positions. If they are going for the double leg, he will keep his legs wide apart to prevent his opponent from joining their hands together underneath his hips in order to complete the takedown. He will mainly use his overhook to try and lift his opponent away from his legs, but if they decide to stay attacking the double leg and keep their head down at his hip, he will use his free hand to elbow, forcing them to lift their head up and settle for an upper body clinch. Most fighters are vulnerable when they are stuck in a double under body lock, but Adesanya doesn't seem to have too much trouble dealing with it. His height advantage means that it's difficult for his opponents to use the body lock to upset his balance. When his opponent's hands are locked together, Adesanya knows that he doesn't have the option to escape, so he waits for them to separate their hands after failing the takedowns. Once their hands are separated, he now has the option to exit out to the side, but he has to wait for the right opportunity to do so. He will first control their free arm, preventing them from striking or entering into another body lock or double leg. Once the arm is controlled, he will wait until the opponent starts putting weight towards the remaining underhook. After feeling the weight shift, he will take his overhook out and drag their collar in the same direction as their weight is moving to allow him to escape out to the other side. I think Adesanya has had the most successful MMA transition in history due to his ability to bolt on the grappling skills required to keep all of his fights at striking range. It's hard to see any middleweight taking the belt off him in the near future, especially considering the improvements he's making between fights. What do you think of Adesanya's transition to MMA? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, I'll see you for the next one.